See Mitchell, Clark, what
A room packed with people, each with their own opinion. Names get thrown around, big legends, icons, household names. Then one name drops, Caitlin Clark. A pause, silence, and then someone finally says it. She's number one, not top three, not just a contender, number one. And here's the wild part, nobody argued. Not over Larry Bird, not over David Beckham, not even Conor McGregor. Every other name was dissected, debated, and eliminated without a shred of mercy. But Caitlin Clark, she didn't just survive the discussion, she ended it. A girl from Iowa, a league most ignored, a sport sidelined for decades. So what did she do that no one else could? Stick around, because what comes next will completely change the way you view women's sports. Even before turning pro, even before stepping on a single WNBA court, Caitlin Clark had already achieved something unprecedented. She captured the attention of casual fans, people who had never once watched a women's game, forcing them to stop scrolling, to watch, to care. And it all started in Iowa, at a small state school.
Caitlin Clark is one of the best, if not the best, in girls high school hoops, at least here in the state of Iowa in the 5-on-5 era.
College basketball used to be fine, but on a typical Friday night, hardly anyone was paying attention. Caitlin Clark changed all of that almost overnight. She was raining step-back threes from NBA level range, launching full-court passes that looked like they belonged in a professional mixtape. Every move carried an attitude that screamed, "Size doesn't scare me. I'm taking the shot anyway." And she delivered every single time. The clips went viral, then viral again and again. But here's the part most people overlook. It wasn't just the shots. It was how she played. There was a confidence on the court that felt entirely new. She didn't play cautious basketball. She didn't tiptoe around mistakes. She attacked every possession like she had something to prove, and all the time in the world to prove it. That energy, it jumped off the screen. People who had never cared about women's basketball were suddenly sharing her highlights in group chats. Coaches started showing her tape to their own players. Even sports accounts that had never touched the women's game began posting her clips because the engagement was impossible to ignore. Games that once drew quiet crowds at Iowa began filling with fans. Students who had never set foot in Carver Hawkeye Arena showed up with painted faces. Season tickets sold out. The atmosphere transformed. This wasn't just basketball anymore. This felt historic. Then came March 2023, Iowa versus LSU, Caitlin Clark versus Angel Reese, an NCAA championship showdown. Clark pushed Reese, Reese squared up, sparks flew, the game exploded. It became the most watched women's college basketball game in history at that point. Over 9.9 million viewers tuned in, a record that had never been touched before. People who had never searched for women's basketball in their lives watched. Some came for the rivalry, some came because social media wouldn't stop buzzing, some just wanted to see what this Clark girl was really capable of. And when it ended, they didn't go away. They started following the players, learning the names, Angel Reese, Gabby Marshall. They formed opinions about Iowa basketball as if they'd been fans for years. That's not what happens when someone is simply talented. Talent earns respect. Talent gets a highlight on SportsCenter. But talent alone doesn't build an audience from scratch in a sport that mainstream media had long ignored. Caitlin Clark did something different. She made people feel something. Curiosity, excitement, the urgent need to see what she would do next. And she built all of that before ever being drafted, before ever playing a professional game. That tells you everything about what was coming next. Forget the highlights for a moment. Look at what happened to the WNBA after Clark arrived. Take the Indiana Fever, for example. Her new team had been one of the quietest franchises in the league. Average attendance, average viewership, average everything. They weren't bad, they just existed. A team hardcore fans knew, but hardly anyone outside that circle cared about. And that was about to change.
Caitlin Clark pushes Angel Reese, and Angel Reese gets right up into Caitlin Clark.
Then Caitlin Clark arrived, and everything changed. Fever games started selling out. Road games sold out too. And it wasn't because Indiana suddenly became a championship contender. It was because people wanted to see her play. Think about that. Fans from opposing cities were filling arenas just for Clark. The visiting team became the main attraction. That had never happened in WNBA history. Arenas that had never worried about crowd control were suddenly bringing in extra staff. Parking lots that used to sit half empty were now jammed an hour before tip-off. Teams that were used to slipping through airports unnoticed were being stopped for photos in cities they were only visiting. All of it because of one player. The TV ratings told the same story. Viewership across the league jumped like never before.
The effort, the enthusiasm, wrestling mentality, toughness.
And it wasn't just Fever games. Every matchup got a boost. Casual fans who tuned in for Clark began watching other games too, sticking around for the league as a whole. And then it happened. Clark went down with an injury. She missed games, and the ripple effect was immediate.
He was definitely in some pain there. Missed 4 games with that groin injury.
Clip when Clark went down, the effect was staggering. Viewership across the entire league plummeted by roughly 50%. And it wasn't just Indiana games. Every matchup, every team, even those with nothing to do with her injury felt the drop. One player, half the audience, gone. It's almost unbelievable until you really sit with it. No professional league should hinge so heavily on a single individual. But that dependency also speaks volumes about what she had built. You don't lose half your viewers unless half your viewers were there for that one person in the first place. Now, take a look at what was happening across the league during that same period. The Wnba turned a profit for the first time ever. A league that had been running in the red for over 20 years finally entered the black. The following CBA negotiations brought historic pay increases. Women who had previously needed overseas contracts just to make ends meet were suddenly being offered deals that reflected their true value. New TV agreements were signed. ESPN created dedicated broadcast blocks for women's basketball, something that had never existed before. Everything was changing, and it all traced back to what Caitlin Clark had sparked.
Gas, you've got to give Texas credit. They're an incredible team. They hit first, but South Carolina hit back.
Clip games that once got buried on secondary channels were now landing primetime spots on the main network. Completely unrivaled. A brand new offseason league launched with real investment and a real audience. Something that simply wouldn't exist without the fan base Clark had built. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a single viral highlight. This was structural change. Not a good season, not a fleeting moment, but a permanent shift in the business of women's basketball. All driven by one player who hadn't even finished her second professional year. Every other name eliminated. To claim Clark is the most influential white athlete of all time is bold. Very bold. And to make that case, you have to go through some serious competition. Let's start with Michael Phelps. 23 Olympic gold medals. The most decorated Olympian in history. A swimmer so dominant that scientists debated whether his body was barrier to entry was high enough that even the greatest swimmer of all time couldn't convert his dominance into widespread participation. Phelps was iconic, but his influence had a natural ceiling. Next, David Beckham. Globally, his impact is undeniable. Bend It Like Beckham was a hit. He was everywhere. In fashion, in media. Married to Victoria Beckham. You could have never watched a single soccer match and still known exactly who he was. That kind of crossover fame is extremely rare. But in America, his story hits a limit. When he joined LA Galaxy, he was supposed to bring soccer into the mainstream. And while he became a massive celebrity, he didn't transform how Americans actually engaged with the sport. Fame doesn't always equal structural change. Then there's Larry Bird, the basketball icon. 3 championships, 3 MVPs, 12 All-Star appearances. The legendary rivalry with Magic Johnson helped save the NBA in the 1980s. One of the greatest to ever touch a basketball. Undeniable. But here's the honest question. How many kids grew up building their game around Larry Bird? Admired? Absolutely. Feared? Definitely. Respected by all? Of course. But his influence stayed mostly at the elite level. It didn't fundamentally change who played the game or who watched it. Finally, Conor McGregor, the strongest cultural case outside of team sports. The trash talk, the style, the suits, the press conferences watched by people who had no interest in MMA itself. The working class Irish kid who convinced the world he was royalty, and it worked. The issue, his influence was fleeting. A few dominant years, a handful of monumental events, then it passed. McGregor made MMA bigger, but he didn't rewrite the ecosystem. He didn't create a new foundation for fans or players to follow long term, and that's where Caitlin Clark is different.
First sight for Victoria and David Beckham, and it's been a romance for the ages ever since. The British football star and the former Spice Girls singer.
The sport didn't undergo a lasting transformation because of him. When McGregor stepped back, the attention stepped back with him. Tony Hawk, on the other hand, is the underrated example everyone in the room actually agreed on. He took skateboarding from a niche subculture, something most of mainstream America either ignored or looked down on. and turned it into a phenomenon that kids in suburbs and cities everywhere wanted to be part of. The Tony Hawk Pro Skater video games alone introduced an entire generation to skate culture, kids who would never have encountered it otherwise. Lil Wayne's mid-2000s aesthetic, the skinny jeans, the skate-inspired influence on hip-hop fashion, traces a direct line back to Tony Hawk. You know who Tony Hawk is, even if you've never seen him land a trick. That is real influence. But here's where Caitlin Clark pulls ahead of every name on this list. Phelps, Beckham, Bird, McGregor, Hawk. They were all influential within their sport or cultural lane. None of them walked into a league that was struggling financially and left it profitable. None created an entirely new audience for a sport the mainstream had ignored for decades, and none did it in under 2 professional seasons. Tony Hawk changed a subculture. Caitlin Clark changed an industry. That is the difference. Once you see that clearly, the debate has nowhere left to go. And that's where Serena Williams comes into the conversation. This is the real comparison. If you're making the case for Caitlin Clark as the most influential white athlete of all time, eventually you have to confront this question. What about Serena Williams? And it deserves a real answer, not a deflection, not a dismissal, an honest, thoughtful response. Serena Williams wasn't just great at tennis. She dominated for 2 full decades, carrying women's tennis on her back in a way few athletes in any sport have ever done. Her supremacy was so complete, so sustained, that her opponents often became famous simply for facing her. You didn't need to win a Grand Slam to earn recognition. Push Serena to a 3rd set and the world knew your name by morning. Think about that. She made other players famous just by competing against her. Naomi Osaka cried after beating Serena at the US Open, not because she hadn't been good before, but because she had just overcome one of the greatest athletes of all time.
Oh, he tagged him in the left, Mike. He hurt him.
And up top.
He hurt Poirier with that left.
Winning the biggest match of her career came with a complicated weight for Serena Williams. Because of who she had just beaten, that was the burden she carried everywhere. Generations of players grew up watching Serena. Coco Gauff, for example, spoke about her as if describing a religion. Her confidence, her belief that she belonged on the grandest stages, her entire approach to tennis was shaped by seeing Serena exist, dominate, and redefine women's tennis. Serena's influence still runs deep. Players she inspired are still competing at the highest level today. Her impact, probably the most complete legacy any athlete has ever built in any sport. Full stop. So how does Caitlin Clark even enter this conversation? Here's the argument, and once you hear it clearly, it's difficult to dismiss. Serena transformed tennis, but tennis, even at its peak, is a sport most Americans interact with just a couple of times a year. The Australian Open, Wimbledon, maybe the French Open if it comes up in conversation. The US Open draws attention, and then it disappears again until the next Grand Slam. Even at Serena's absolute peak, winning everything, appearing on every magazine, turning matches into must-watch television, stop a random person on the street and ask them to name 3 women's tennis players besides Serena. Most couldn't. One name carried the entire sport in the public imagination. Basketball is different. Basketball lives in America year-round. It's on every playground, in every city, every school has a gym with a hoop, every sports bar has a game on at least one screen. The NBA is woven into the culture in a way tennis never has been. That gave the women's game a foundation Serena never had. Clark walked into that environment and did something no one had managed for decades. She made people care about women's basketball. Not just tolerate it, not just respect it, actually care. Tune in, follow the players, form opinions, buy tickets. You can now name more WNBA players than you could 5 years ago. Not because talent suddenly spiked, though it did, but because Clark made you want to know who was on the court with her, who was guarding her, who was her teammate, who was talking trash afterward. Kelsey Mitchell, Aaliyah Boston, Angel Reese, Brianna Stewart, names casual sports fans now recognize, players who were invisible before Clark arrived. She didn't just grow her own audience, she grew the audience for the entire league, and that's what makes the Serena versus Clark comparison so complex. Serena dominated her sport like no one else. Her legacy in tennis is untouchable, but even at her peak, tennis was largely a twice-a-year conversation for most Americans. Clark entered a sport already embedded in American culture and made the women's version matter to fans who had ignored it for years. Two completely different types of influence. Serena's was deep within one world. Clark's spread wider across a world already paying attention. Which matters more depends entirely on how you define influence. And that's why this debate doesn't have a clean answer, and why it's the most fascinating part of the conversation. Here's the uncomfortable truth. After just 2 professional seasons, Caitlin Clark has not won a WNBA championship. She hasn't earned a scoring title. She hasn't collected the awards that normally define a legacy. No rings, no MVP, no moment lifting a trophy while confetti falls, and the world agrees she has arrived. And yet, influence isn't always measured in hardware.
If you would.
She's played less than 2 full professional seasons, and yet the league is profitable for the first time ever. New TV deals are in place. Player salaries have skyrocketed in ways they never had before. Arenas that used to sit half empty on a random Tuesday night are now selling out weeks in advance. Millions of fans who had never watched a single WNBA game are now following the league, learning the players, forming opinions about matchups. All of this before her career has even truly begun. Step back for a second and let that sink in. Think about how unusual that is. Larry Bird played 13 seasons, won 3 championships.
Caitlin Clark last played for Indiana against
a rivalry that nearly saved an entire league. Conversations about his legacy didn't start overnight. They came after years of work, after he had already achieved everything possible at the highest level. His impact was undeniable, but it arrived at the end of a full career, giving fans time to watch, analyze, and compare. David Beckham spent over 2 decades in professional football. His cultural influence, the crossover fame, the fashion, the global recognition was the result of years of visibility across multiple countries and chapters of his career. Michael Phelps competed in 5 Olympic Games. His
give and go with Sobers, Bird.
legacy took shape over nearly 20 years of elite swimming, spanning 4 different Olympic cycles, and a body of work that no one had ever come close to matching. Conor McGregor fought his way through years of smaller promotions before earning a UFC title shot. Tony Hawk spent nearly a decade grinding in skate competitions before the video games and cultural spotlight arrived. Every one of them had long, full careers before conversations about their influence became serious. Caitlin Clark, she didn't wait. She changed the entire ecosystem of her sport before she had a championship ring, before she had a scoring title, before her professional career had even fully unfolded.
How will she go for history?
There she goes again. Yes!
And all of this happened before the second chapter of her professional career had even begun. Her influence arrived before the legacy was officially written, and that almost never happens. Think about what that means for what's still coming. If she accomplished all of this in less than 2 seasons, without a championship, without individual awards, while still learning the ropes of her first professional year, then imagine what's next. What happens when she starts winning? What happens when the team around her improves and the Fever become a genuine contender? What happens after 4 or 5 more years of this momentum? The numbers will become impossible to ignore. The comparisons will become harder to make. And here's the most important part. When she went down with an injury last season and missed significant time, the fans didn't disappear. The attention and infrastructure she had built stayed intact. New viewers she had brought in continued watching. They followed other teams, tracked other players, and kept ratings higher than they had ever been before Clark arrived. Here's where we land. Caitlin Clark is 25 years old. She's played less than 2 professional seasons, and already she has a stronger case for being the most influential white athlete of all time than players who spent 15 years building their legacies. This isn't hype. This is the scoreboard. New CBA, new TV deals. First ever profit in WNBA history. Arenas that never sold out now selling out. A sport that was invisible to millions becoming common conversation at dinner tables, all because of one player from Iowa. Whether you came in already convinced or walked in thinking this was a ridiculous claim, the numbers don't lie. Drop your take in the comments. Who is your pick for the most influential white athlete of all time?